Well, thank you, Nathan. And it is fun for me to be able to be with you guys here this morning. I know some of you are longtime harvesters, some of you are a little bit newer, so you probably wouldn't know this. But Harvest Vineyard is actually where I connected with the Vineyard Church. And nearly 20 years ago, today, God met me in a powerful way through this church, and a few years down the road, surprise, surprise, I ended up a part of the Vineyard Church. It was actually kind of funny. It was in Montreal, and the church that we joined there, we didn't even actually know they were a vineyard when we joined them. It was about 3 or 4 weeks in, and we're like, "Oh, you guys are Vineyard? Yeah, we know Vineyard." So it is fun that we can kind of do this as our wider church family. You guys are my cousins from down the road, and again, some of you may realize that we had our Edmonton Vineyards pastors retreat just this past few days, and that is always a special time for us as the leaders of the various churches to get away together. We spend every morning in worship and prayer together. And, it doesn't matter how long you've been doing this journey, we all still need to sit in God's presence. We all need to encounter Jesus. We all need to hear his voice. We all need to be surprised by his voice. And to me, that's still a mystery. I've been a Christian for a long time now. Sometimes it feels kind of wrong how I am still surprised when Jesus speaks to me. It's like, oh, Lord, you really are there, and you do see me. Oh, but it's a special thing, and it's a warm thing, and we all need that. And I think sometimes we forget the little ways. Even like sometimes, yes, we see the big ways that God speaks to us, but often, I think God's a chatterbox. I don't think he stops talking. I just think sometimes we don't always listen. And we sometimes miss him. And so I guess that's my hope and prayer for all of us, is that we would, have tender hearts to hear his voice. And, again, this is a special opportunity for me to be here with you guys. I wanted to publicly thank you guys. Thank you for the worship this morning. I love that worship has been such a value for Harvest. And I know that your guys' value for worship has had a really positive influence on the other Vineyard churches, not just here in the city, but far and wide. And I thank you for that. Thank you for tending that flame. And I also publicly wanted to thank you for hosting the prayer summit. I know that was a little while ago, but I really enjoyed coming and participating in the summit this year, and sitting there and just soaking in the worship and soaking in God's presence, and celebrating Jesus our King. So thank you, Ruth and team, for all the work that you guys pour into that, and thank you guys for hosting that, because worship really does need to be a value. It needs to be a part of who we are. It is part of encounter, and it's part of just honoring Jesus. This is also, this morning is just getting more and more special as we go. But this morning is also a special one for me, because Bob and Audrey Carroll are here with you guys this morning, and every once in a while I get to bump into these guys, but part of my journey, Bob and Audrey were actually my pastors for a number of years. My wife, Christy, and I actually met at Northgate Baptist Church, and Bob and Audrey were the pastors there, and so they pastored us for years. Bob and Audrey actually mentored Christy and I for a little while after we got married. And so it's special for me, for them to be here this morning as well. So, specialness all around. So why don't we jump into what I have prepared for you guys this morning? You can see here that the title of my message is "Scattering Flowers and Spreading Mustard." So it gives you a little hint to where I'm maybe going to go, a little surprise at the ending. But this morning, I'm going to take a look at one of Jesus's parables. And you guys might know this, but Jesus can often be quite provocative. And it's usually because the way that Jesus presents the world is often quite different than the way that most people see it. Nate was mentioning again this morning, you guys are moving. The church is moving. And I'm quite excited for you guys with your church move. I think that there's a lot of potential for you guys as a church in this move. And sometimes moves can be hard, sometimes they can be a bit complicated, but they can also often shake things up in kind of a good way, where, the things that are really of value stick, and the things that need to change have room to change. So I think there's some really great potential for you guys, even with just some of the opportunities that might be coming up with other organizations that you can partner with in the community. I think that Jesus is going to surprise you guys where he might show up. And so overall, I think that this move will help you as a church to have a greater positive influence in the community and elsewhere. And I think it'll also open up some good opportunities of service for you guys, which, as we all know, opportunities of service really help us grow as disciples of Jesus. So, in this, something that we often run into in our culture is this sort of ingrained attitude that bigger is better. And and sometimes we have to confront that. I don't think that God is about the whole bigger is better mentality. I think that God sees beyond that to the deeper values. And I don't think the Bible teaches bigger is better. And so today, we're going to explore one of Jesus' parables where I think he lays it out pretty well, what his perspective is. And I hope that this thought, this idea, this reflection might be a good one for you guys as you approach your move. So just to open here, I have a couple questions for you guys. So put your thinking caps on, rack your brains, and can you think of some great men and women in history and their accomplishments? Billy Graham. Billy Graham recently passed, and yes, he accomplished much. Anyone else? People that you can think of, Christian or non-Christian, that were just had major influence in world history. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, yes, another great one. Champion of the underground church. William Wallace, yes, hey, he's one of my favorites. So yeah, again, somebody that fought for justice. Anna Whitall Smith. Any others? You can just shout out names. John Wimber. What was that one? Mother Teresa. Yes, Mother Teresa is a good one as well. What about in the fields of education, government, art, philosophy? Can you think of names of Christian people who've been influential in those fields, like education, government? What was that, sorry? Wilberforce, yes. Is it a bit harder to think of names in those specific fields? Maybe a little bit. The crazy thing is, in each of those fields, education, government, art, and philosophy, when you look at world history, many of the main influencers and thinkers were Christian people. But we don't really know their names. And I think it's kind of interesting. That obviously the field of education has such a huge, massive influence on Western culture, and yet we can't think of that many people who influenced education. So it's had a massive influence, but we don't know who the influencers were. And I think that kind of shows us that when we find great men and women of God in history, and we do, I think that sometimes that is actually God's plan B. I mean, think about in the Old Testament. When did the prophets come on the scene? Were the prophets, they were there when everything was going great and people were following God? Or when the people kind of needed a course correction? It was when people got off track that then God had to raise somebody up to get their attention again. But I think God prefers it when all of his people are obeying him, when more people are walking in consistent faithfulness with the little things. Sometimes, though, I think, people can get complacent or apathetic. And sometimes we just doubt that little old me could really make a difference. And so we wait for someone else to do the big things. We have a tendency, like the Israelites with Moses, when they said to him, Moses, meeting God is too scary for us. So why don't you go up on the mountain for us? Why don't you go meet God and then you come tell us what God said? You know, and how sad for the Israelites that they got robbed of being able to encounter God's presence for themselves. You know, it's not too far down the road where we have that incident where the 70 are prophesying in the camp. And Moses says, "Oh, that's wonderful. I wish that you all heard directly from God." So I think that when we wait for the big, whether it's, you know, a big project or a building or a person, I think we might be missing it a little bit. I think that maybe we need to try and tune our eyes a little bit more to look for the small. Now, somebody did mention Mother Teresa as a great historical influence, and she is. But think of the way that Mother Teresa did it. She herself said, "We can do no great things, only small things with great love." And I think that is a good perspective for us to have. So with that, here is the parable that I'm going to read to you guys this morning. You might be familiar with this one, Matthew 13. This is one of his shorter ones, but we read starting in verse 31. Here is another illustration that Jesus used. "The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed planted in a field. It is the smallest of all seeds, but it becomes the largest of garden plants. It grows into a tree, and birds come and make nests in its branches." Now, this is a passage that you might be familiar with. It is a popular one of Jesus' stories. But one of the challenges, you know, if you've ever tried to really get into understanding the biblical language, and maybe you've studied a little bit of Greek or whatnot, one of the challenges we have, the difficulty in reading Jesus' words, is that we're reading it 2,000 years after he said it. And we don't get the benefit of hearing his tone of voice. You know, tone of voice can convey a lot. Anyone here familiar with sarcasm? You know, some of you are probably pretty good at it. But you know that you can say something, but your tone of voice can really shift what's being said. And tone really can convey a lot. And I think that you know, I don't know how people can imagine that God didn't have a sense of humor. Like, I think God has a sense of humor. I mean, God gave us a sense of humor, so it must have come from him. And so I'm pretty sure that Jesus had a sense of humor and probably joked around with the boys. And I do think that sometimes in some of Jesus' stories, what we're seeing is a little bit of that sense of humor, maybe even a little bit of sarcasm that we don't totally recognize. And I think that there's a chance that there's some of that at work here this morning. I think it's possible that in this parable, Jesus is being intentionally provocative and maybe even a little bit sarcastic. I don't think Jesus is just pointing out how his kingdom grows and expands, but I think he could also be making a sarcastic statement about the cultural expectations and in a way saying, this is what my kingdom isn't like. So in this parable, Jesus tells his listeners that the kingdom of God is like mustard, which grows like a wild bush. Now, in Mediterranean climates, such as Galilee, the most common mustard was a black mustard. And in that area, it was a managed weed, and it looked a little bit like that. Now, does that look like the largest of garden plants? Not to me, it doesn't. You know, but this was a plant that was quite popular in the area. The people would have been familiar with it. The mustard seed's growth would have been familiar to his first century audience, and I think its symbolic meaning would have been a lot more clear. Here is a field of this wild mustard. And I can just picture a crowd of people, you know, gathered on the hillside, listening to Jesus speak. And, you know, Jesus often preferred his outdoor theater. You know, so he's got the crowd gathered on the hill and, you know, the clouds and the blue sky behind him. But he's also got a field of mustard behind him. And he's telling them that God's rescue plan is in action. The kingdom of God has come to bring restoration and healing, to reconnect people's hearts to God. And he tells them to turn from their selfishness and to give their lives to God. And he points to the wild mustard in the fields surrounding them, and he tells them that God's plan of restoration is like a weed. And at first, that might sound a little bit puzzling. Like, how many of you would like positive things in your lives described as weeds? Weeds typically aren't that flattering. And I kind of think it may have been the same way for them back then. What are you saying, Jesus, that your kingdom's like a weed? Like many people today, the first century Jews actually really valued order. They even had very strict rules about how to keep a tidy garden. And one of those rules was to keep out mustard. Mustard was notorious for invading and taking over entire gardens. And I mean, we wouldn't know. We're stuck in perpetual winter right now. We should be having weeds poking up through our sidewalks by now, but we don't yet. We're still dealing with snow. But we know from our own experience, spring and summer, you want that nice, tidy backyard that is often getting invaded by another little yellow pest. We wrestle with keeping tidy, ordered gardens. We wrestle with keeping the weeds out of our lives. So what is Jesus saying? What might Jesus be saying in comparing his kingdom to a weed? Well, I think, in a subversive way, I think he's saying some pretty good things. I think he's maybe saying that his kingdom has staying power. It's persistent. I think he's maybe saying that there is great potential for his kingdom just to infiltrate all of life. I think maybe he's trying to communicate to people like, hey, you can't control it, and it's not always going to be neat and tidy. And I think he's maybe even saying people don't like weeds. Many people will actually oppose my kingdom. But I think he might also be making another point here, a cultural one that we kind of miss. But we have just celebrated Easter, and Easter is a season where we celebrate the victory of Jesus over death. But if you remember the story, walking through the Passion Week, Easter is also a season to remember misplaced expectations. Because the people thought that he was going to come as a conquering king, which he was. He just conquered in a way that they weren't expecting. And at that time in history, many people had these great expectations about what the next great move of God was going to look like. They had hopes of the kingdom of God coming in a spectacular triumph and great majesty. That's what Palm Sunday is all about. That's that victory march. They were expecting this triumphant king. And they would have been, at the time, they would have been familiar with much of the Old Testament imagery. And in a lot of the Old Testament imagery, when it talked about this coming time where God was going to rule and reign, some of the imagery that was used was, one of those terms was the cedars of Lebanon. The cedars of Lebanon were majestic trees that could grow up to 130 feet tall. And if you guys have ever seen any monster trees, like they are pretty majestic to behold. Many years I go on a motorcycle trip with Terry Harsh from OSV and a few other guys, and 2 years ago we rode to Vancouver Island, and there's that redwood forest there or whatever, and riding your motorbike through there and seeing these giant monster trees that, I can't even guess the diameter of the trunks, like it was, more than a dozen feet. And you just think, how can something living be so huge? And how old is it? And it's just, there's a sense of awe. And they almost feel royal, just in their majesty, these big, grand trees. And that's how it's portrayed in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, the imagery of great earthly kingdoms or worldly pride was portrayed as these grand cedars of Lebanon. Not only were the kingdoms portrayed as these grand cedars, but these grand cedars had majestic eagles nesting in their branches. And, the eagles could often represent other nations. But these were images of power. So the majestic image of cedars and eagles, it was an image that these people could relate to. It was an image that would inspire them. This was an image of God's kingdom, his work in the world that they could get excited about. And Jesus seems to be sarcastically confronting that image and that cultural expectation. Instead of 130-foot tall, majestic cedars filled with eagles, Jesus gives them mustard that full grown were about 3 feet high. And then he says, and a bird will make its nest in it. Now, I don't know about you. I'm not sure how well you can see that picture. But can you imagine a bird perched in that? A hummingbird, maybe? Yeah. Like a nest wouldn't even fit in the top of that. So what is Jesus doing here? Well, I think that he's giving a bit of a contrast. I think he's contrasting 130-foot tall trees with 3-foot shrubs. And he's saying, and you have eyes for eagles, but I'm showing you birds. And it just kind of seems like a crazy picture. And Jesus' provocative contrast, it continues with his use of the term birds even. He says birds will make nests in it. Well, the word that he uses here isn't the one that was used for eagles, for the grand imagery. The word that Jesus uses in this parable is the word that's used for common birds. It's used in Peter's vision in Acts chapter 10 to describe birds that were unclean for the Jews. So, where the imagery of eagles often indicated powerful nations, Jesus' use of the term birds could be referring to Gentiles, to people who weren't Jews, or to people who were viewed as less desirable, which I think is actually good news for us. You know, everyone, including outcasts and undesirables, have room in Jesus' kingdom. And we can all find rest in the mustard. Now, I think, the people wanted to see a kingdom come that would look great, look like these big, strong trees. And Jesus gives them pesky, persistent weeds that eventually will take over the garden. But I think we need to remember that just because mustard doesn't look big and majestic doesn't mean that it's not powerful. Mustard, in the history of this little plant, has always been known for its fiery pungency. It is a powerful herb that needs to be diluted before humans can consume it. Mustard has also always been known for healing. It was rubbed on the chest to help with breathing, sort of like a Vicks vapor rub. So God's unassuming, persistent kingdom provides a safe place for all people, and it's a kingdom that brings healing and whose power is not by the world's standards. God's kingdom is not only or even primarily found in people or places of might and wealth and great power. Like the tiny mustard seed, which, when it grows to its fullest, is still only a shrub. The kingdom in our midst may not appear to be towering or overpowering by human standards, yet I think the kingdom is still strong enough for birds to rest in its shade, for hope to have room to grow, for freedom to take root, and for the faith of a few, and that would be us, to influence the many towards healing and justice and peace. I think Jesus' kingdom rule can actually seem small to us if we can miss it. But with persistence, it has a huge impact. We briefly mentioned a little earlier Mother Teresa and her perspective. Some of you would know this, but she wasn't actually born Teresa. Her given name was Agnes. And she was born in a city called Skopje. I don't know, Skopje, different pronunciations, which is now in Macedonia. But according to the Catholic tradition, when she took on her new calling, when she joined a religious order, she took this new name to signify this new calling, and she took the name Teresa. And she actually took this name Teresa from another Catholic saint who was named Thérèse de Lisieux. And this Teresa actually lived not that much before Mother Teresa herself. Thérèse de Lisieux was born in 1873, lived a relatively short life to 1897, but she was born into a devout Catholic family in Normandy. She joined a Carmelite convent, when she was just 15. So she really had a heart for Jesus at a young age, and she loved reading about the stories of the various Christian saints and the things that they had accomplished for God. And when she joined her religious order, she joined with this desire, this strong desire. She wanted to be a heroic missionary. She wanted to have adventures for Jesus, and she even dreamed about maybe being martyred for her faith. She was all in. But things went a fair bit differently for her, because early in her years, in her later teens, she started to develop a number of health conditions. And her health conditions actually kept her confined to her convent. Despite all her wishes and dreams to be this heroic missionary, she never even got to leave her convent. And being confined to her convent, never getting to go do these big adventures, she died at the age of 24. But during her years at the convent and her disappointment at not being able to accomplish big, significant acts for Jesus, because of her health issues, she discovered the great significance of small things. And she had a number of writings. One of her writings is titled The Little Way. And in The Little Way, she says this: "I know well, Jesus, that love can only be repaid by love. What I've always looked for and have found at last is some way of satisfying my feelings by returning love for your love. But this love of mine, how can I show it? Love needs to be proved by action. Well, even a little child can scatter flowers to scent the throne room with their fragrance. Even a little child can sing in its shrill treble the great canticle of love. Well, that shall be my life, to scatter flowers, to miss no single opportunity of making some small sacrifice, here by a smiling look, there by a kindly word, always doing the tiniest things right and doing it for love." And I think there's something powerful in that. Like, how often do we take simple things like that for granted? And yet it's an army of people doing simple things like this, that would turn the world upside down. I mean, we hear stories south of the border, all these shootings and, different oppression, injustice, people hurting people. And just think of the movement, the power of a community of people that would not forsake the simple acts, that would give love for love, that could scatter flowers wherever we go. I know that, and this was our church meets in a neighborhood similar to you guys here, and a number of years ago, my wife and I, we moved into our neighborhood so that we could, sort of be a bit more incarnational in the way the church served the neighborhood. And honestly, when we moved in there, it was like, yeah, God, let's get this big, program going, and we're going to do justice, and we're going to save all these people in the neighborhood, and blah, 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 blah. And, we have done some programs, and we have seen some results from that. But I think after reading Teresa's story, I challenged myself, and I was amazed at the results. My next big initiative was when I was walking around the neighborhood, I was going to smile at people and maybe even say hi. And it was crazy. Like, walking in our neighborhood, like often, because there is some crime there and whatnot, people intentionally wouldn't look your direction. They would stare down and look the other way because people were actually trying to avoid eye contact. And people were almost afraid of making eye contact. But when you finally got the opportunity to make eye contact with someone and say hi, you could see their countenance change. It was like, hi. And it's almost like changing the atmosphere of the neighborhood with a smile and a hello. And it was powerful. One of the other opportunities that we've had there is we help out quite consistently with the food bank in our neighborhood. And after being there for a number of years, I've gradually got to know many of the people's names that come in for food bank. And seriously, I think one of the biggest blessings I've been able to give these people, instead of, yes, giving them some help with some food that they might need, is knowing their names. There is one lady that she comes in, she's an older lady, she's not always the most well-kept, half of her teeth are missing, but when she comes in with these beautiful childlike eyes, and she just stares at me. And what she's waiting for is for me to call her by name. She knows that I know her name. And so she stares at me until I say, "Hi, Anna." And when I say, "Hi, Anna," like, she lights up because someone knows her name. And it's such a simple gift that we can give, and I think, and God is in it. So I think that we need to remember that, God controls his kingdom, and he controls the spread of his kingdom. We don't. We get to participate, we get to join in the adventure, we get to join in the journey. And God can use even our simple acts of kindness and love to infiltrate this world and to bring healing and restoration. Simple acts of kindness and love, they don't look like mighty cedars, but I think they have power, and I think that they can bring healing, just like mustard. So consistent faithfulness to the little things that God puts in our path, I think, can result in kingdom healing, in justice, in restoration and peace. And it can result in it spreading like a weed. And that is where we can scatter flowers and he spreads the mustard, which kind of sounds like a weird sandwich. But I think, when I think of you guys, and I think of your move to this other school, I think it might help position you guys to scatter more flowers in this community. Chatting with Nate, and I know that there are some other community organizations that you guys are going to be closely located to, that I think you can maybe work with those organizations to scatter some flowers in this neighborhood. I think, there's some other community initiatives here. I know that you guys have been trying to get plugged in with the Tegler, which I think is great. Again, just another area that you guys can scatter some flowers. And I think that, again, this is something simple. Like, this just scattering flowers just doesn't have to happen on a Sunday or when you're, coming for a church event. There are opportunities daily for you guys to scatter flowers at work or at school, wherever you are. And it can be as simple as getting to know someone's name and saying hi with a smile on your face. And having said that, I know that one obstacle that many of us will probably encounter when it comes to scattering flowers is getting sucked into the frantic pace of our culture with our huge to-do lists. But I think that maybe we need to remember the reality is that the majority of what we think we need to get done, we really don't. I mean, if it doesn't get done, the world's not going to end. And the majority of the stress that we feel over some of these self-imposed obligations, it's all in our heads. I know a quote that really, honestly, I haven't fully embraced this, but I love the idea. I'll share this idea with you. It comes from Henry Nouwen. But he says, "More and more the desire grows in me to simply walk around, greet people, enter into homes, sit on their doorsteps, play ball, throw water, and be known as someone who wants to live with them. It is a privilege to have the time to practice the simple ministry of presence. Still, it's not as simple as it seems. My own desire to be useful, to do something significant, or to be a part of some impressive project is so strong that soon my time is taken up by meetings, conferences, study groups, and workshops that prevent me from walking the streets. It is difficult not to have plans, not to organize people around an urgent cause, and not to feel that you are working directly for social progress. But I wonder more and more if the first thing shouldn't be to know people by name, to eat and drink with them, to listen to their stories and to tell your own, and to let them know with words, handshakes, and hugs that you do not simply like them, but truly love them." again, it's an invitation for us to scatter flowers and let Jesus spread the mustard. So I think, think of your life right now, and if your life seems a little too full to find some opportunity to scatter some flowers, then maybe you need to have an honest heart-to-heart with God and ask Him to help you reprioritize. And especially in the next little while, you guys are going to be going through some change as a church, which I think is an invitation to help you refocus. And maybe you could consider revamping some of your life routine as well. Letting God break into your lives and into your hearts in a special way again. So that's what I got for you this morning. Jesus, one of the most amazing gifts I think that you bring to us, Lord, is that you really do show us the Father. And Lord, we needed you to come in person to show us the Father. We can hear stories about what God's like. We can even sometimes encounter what God's like. But Jesus, we have really short memories. And we needed an image in the flesh. We needed a life to come and turn the ways of this world upside down and show us, Jesus, that your ways are so different than our ways. And Lord, your heart is so much bigger than our hearts, and that your patience is so much more enduring than our patience, and your desire for people to find hope and healing is so much bigger than our desire for hope and healing. And Jesus, you are way more creative in the ways that you do it. And Lord, sometimes it really is just as simple as scattering flowers. Lord, you can spread your kingdom. We just need to be faithful with the little things that you've called us to do. And yeah, maybe those little things will turn into big things, but it doesn't matter if they do or not. What matters is just saying yes to you, Lord. And so this morning, Jesus, we want to say yes to you. And I just ask, Lord, that as we're gathered here as your people, Lord, that we would humbly turn our hearts to you and that you would speak. So, Lord, speak to us now. Holy Spirit, rest on this place and speak to our hearts. Where in our lives, Jesus, might we need to scatter some flowers?